of Ask the Dietitian. This is the April edition. We are in the month of April, right? So we are talking this month about additives, and our participants, yet again, asked so many great questions that we have a lot of content to share. So I wasn't able to cover everything in our first segment of Ask the Dietitian earlier this month. So this is part two. If you missed the first segment, we have it recorded on our YouTube channel. I just watched it yesterday. So it's great if you feel like, you can't, you're going to find so many other resources and educational programs and information on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't already checked it out or subscribed, I encourage you to do that, to consider that. So if you missed part one, you can check it out there. But here is part two today. So I only have a few questions left to answer today. And again, they are such great questions that I want to be able to really hopefully provide a comprehensive review of my answers based on what I know and what I had to research in order to answer the question. So just before I share my screen, hopefully from part one, what you understood was that additives really have been in our food supply for quite some time, and there are governing bodies that determine their safety and also how they arrive at our plate. And but the thing with additives in this country compared to even the rest of the world, because each relative area of the world has their own way of regulating additives as well, it just seems like there's so many like specifics and details, and there's a lot of complexity to all of this. So I think if it's not one-on-one with a dietitian like myself or with your trusted healthcare provider, if you have questions about food additives, I just encourage you maybe to look at some of the resources that I'm going to share at the end of the presentation today, or even just to sort of give pause if you come across some information online on social media or someone talking about additives, because that person hopefully has a really good understanding of the complexities about food additives. If anything, I think I became more informed in preparing for today, but it really helped me understand that there is a lot to know about this, and it's evolving, so I think we're going to only learn more, and we need to just trust our reliable experts when we're obtaining that information. So I just wanted to share that with you today before I share my screen. So thanks for being here. And we're going to get started with part two of our Ask the Dietitian. And we're going to pick up on one of the great questions that have been asked, recently. But, I would say over the past couple decades, we've been asking about genetically modified ingredients and are there any cancer associated risks with eating them? Great question, right? So first of all, let's just start with GMO. GMO, if you aren't familiar, those are defined as organisms in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally. That's kind of like the loose definition, right? Now, since that first definition of GMO, we now use the term genetic engineering. That's sort of interchangeable with GMO, but most of the information I came across more recently, now they've sort of switched to genetic engineered foods or bioengineered. Sometimes you'll see those two terms used interchangeably. And that's sort of, so that's the new term for GMO, and it's the technology that allows for selected individual genes to be transferred from one organism to another. That sounds really crazy, right? Oh, so my understanding, and this has been for quite some time now, is that there are a handful of trusted organizations who are the experts in this that have found that GM foods are safe, genetically modified or GE foods or GMOs, right? Here's the list of them. So the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, so again, these are international, good to know if we don't necessarily trust what's happening here. Internationally, they've been found safe. The World Health Organization of the UN, Codex Alimentarius, who is part of the WHO, the FDA, the USDA, APHIXIS, which is like the Animal and Plant Health Information Society. I wasn't familiar with that group, but that's another resource for you to check out as well. and then of course our EPA. Now, separate from those major institutions that have found that there isn't a concern over GM foods, there are 275 independent science organizations that have all concluded that GMs pose no unique health concerns. They think that we would know by now, it would be very obvious, and they're just pretty definitively, conclusively saying we don't need to be worried about consuming them. Okay, so that's somewhat reassuring, right? Now, if you still feel this way, these are some of the arguments against GE foods, that they can cause an allergic or a toxic reaction when we consume them. They may result in unexpected or harmful genetic changes inside of us. There may be an inadvertent transfer of genes from one GM plant or an animal to another plant or animal that wasn't really in the intention. Foods become less nutritious when actually that's not the case. It's the opposite. We find that GE makes foods more nutritious, and that there's a decrease in there could be a decrease in biodiversity. So that's what some of the arguments against GMO or GE or GM foods have been for quite some time. But all of these concerns have been unfounded, and there's no data, no evidence, which is the collection of all the data that's ever been looked at, has not found any of these concerns to be substantiated. The WHO, the National Academy of Sciences here in the States, among others, have all concluded that they are not harmful for us. I hope you just trust me on that one. GM crops have been consumed safely for over 20 years. We are continuing to adopt other ways of using GM crops. And you might be wondering, why? Why are we doing that? But there's so many benefits, it seems. There's benefits to crop yield. There's increasing crop production in terms of the quality of the crop, apparently. And then there's increases in profits for the farmers. That's great. Now, did you know that most GM crops actually go to animal feed? So most of the genetically modified plants in the States go directly to feed animals. That's because we have a lot of animals to feed that we're gonna, I guess, end up eating. So we need to feed them, right? And they eat a lot of food. So that's partly why there's been such a push for this in the recent years. The next most common use for GM crops are for processed ingredients. So things like oil, things like high fructose corn syrup. So I don't know about you, but now we're starting to see a little bit more unfold here, right? So if you think about it, what foods have oils and what foods have high fructose corn syrup in them? I think many people I work with already are going to kind of go like red flag, alert, alert, high fructose corn syrup. It's not good for us, right? It's not really great for us, right? When we overconsume it. So if you think about it, if you are automatically reducing things like high fructose corn syrup or some of our ultra processed foods that have oils added to them, if we're limiting them, we're automatically eating less GM crops. So hopefully that's a little reassuring to you as well, in that like if we limit ultra processed foods, we're going to benefit from that in more ways than one. And maybe if you have any lingering concerns about GM, this is another way to sort of automatically eat less. It is now mandatory that, and it has been for quite some time, it's mandatory that food companies disclose foods that are or may, I guess they don't know, it may happen that they become bioengineered. I find that pretty wild. So we have a right to know, and that is on the label now. So you can learn, you're going to click on this link when you get these slides, especially if you've registered for the program. You'll go directly towards learning more, learning which crops are genetically modified, what the label looks like. So there's a couple approved labels. So we can look for these things if we're looking to increase our awareness about them and how to lower our consumption if that's something we feel concerned about. However, all of the experts are all in agreement that we don't need to be worried about any harm associated with them. Okay, next question. What are some other sneaky names for sodium that gets hidden in ingredient labels? I love that. They are sneaky, aren't they? They try to hide these things from us. Not so fast, right? So just like a little bit more of schooling about sodium 101. So sodium and salt are not the same thing. Table salt is 40% sodium, 60% chloride. 15% of the sodium we eat comes from natural sources. Did you know that? So sodium is naturally occurring, right? And sometimes like when we hear that word natural, we sort of agree like, oh, that must be fine. Like we're safe then. It's good. It's natural. Not always, but hopefully you understand now. Like it's funny how we kind of hear words like sodium and we think bad, but when we have something like beets, which is great for us, but for so many reasons, just be aware, like, okay, it has a little bit of sodium in it, right? So we want to evaluate foods always with the package that of the nutrients that they contain and not just sort of necessarily rush to judge something as being good or bad because of one of the things it contains. Okay, so I'm just trying to demonstrate another point there. Sodium is added mostly to the sodium we eat is mostly added to packaged and processed foods. So 70% of the food that we eat comes from processed and restaurant food. So again, automatically, we could probably reduce our intake of sodium if we eat less packaged, highly processed food. And maybe if we're eating out every day, if we eat out less, we're probably going to eat less sodium automatically. Why is that concerning? Well, the average American consumes about 3,400 milligrams of sodium, and most surveys find that we underreport what we eat. So chances are that number's higher. And experts regularly recommend that we limit the amount of sodium we eat every day to a certain number. And sometimes my audience knows this, but I'll share it. 2,300 milligrams a day. Pretty alarming, right? So imagine how much consistently we're eating over that number. And we want to try to start to reduce that amount if we can. I'm going to talk more about sodium in the next question too. So here are the following to answer this question. What are the other ingredients that might be a telltale sign that there's sodium in the food? Boom. Here's the list. Now, some of them are pretty obvious. If it says sodium, it's sodium, right? But sometimes things like might sound healthier. There's like that halo effect, like fluoridisol, Himalayan pink salt, it's still sodium, right? Sodium phosphate, trisodium phosphate, sodium glutamate, MSG, rock salt. There's a list, right? Now you can scan labels and you could look for all of these words, but I think there's an easier way to find sodium, and it would be directly on that nutrition facts panel. So we're going to do that next, okay? Because it's exhausting. I don't want you to look up all these words. You might be scared about the food. So now the foods that we eat that are packaged, they can carry labels with a health claim. So sometimes we'll see this on a label. We might see something like salt or sodium free, low sodium, light in sodium, no added salt. And in order to carry that claim, it has to very strictly adhere to the definition. So you can use this little chart as just a reminder. And I think it's helpful because sometimes we'll see something like no salt added, or we might see something like light in sodium. That's deceiving because let's just use light in sodium as an example, or lightly salted. That to me, I get the perception of that's a low sodium food, right? When that's not true. It means that it's 50% less sodium than the regular product. Okay, so if you took something like a can of soup and then labeled it light in sodium, that may not still be light in sodium, right? It's just 50% less than the regular can of soup is. Okay, so really good, helpful chart for you to know. But even more helpful, again, as I shared, is that nutrition facts panel. So right here on the label, we can find sodium. And no matter what sneaky ingredients they try to use, or whatever health claim they try to smack on the front of the label, if we go directly to the nutrition facts panel, they can't hide. That's where it becomes very clear to us, and it's a very straightforward answer for you. And you don't have to mess with all that other information because it is very confusing in my opinion. The nutrition facts panel is pretty confusing too. But for sodium, now we know in this 2/3 cup serving size that there is 160 milligrams of sodium. What does that even mean, right? Well, now you know if we're trying to eat 2,300 milligrams of sodium a day, because that's what experts recommend, that's our budget. So 160 of our 2,300 milligrams for that day. So that's not that much, right? And that's where the percent daily value comes in. So you see 7% for the percent daily value on that line for sodium, and that means it's 7% of the budget for the day for sodium. And it doesn't matter how many calories you're eating, right? all of us, no matter if we're eating 3,000 calories or 1,500 calories, we all need to try to eat less sodium and eat no more than 2,300 milligrams a day. Okay. So a good rule of thumb for sodium, and I always like to share this as well, is that if a serving of food is less than 5% of the daily value, that means it's low in sodium. That means you can probably eat that pretty regularly, pretty consistently. Make sure your serving size matches to the amount, right? If you have double the serving size, then you got to multiply it, right? And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if a serving of food is more than 20% of the daily value, that means it's high in sodium. Because imagine that, let's just say this serving for this nutrition facts panel here was 20%. That means that measly little 2/3 of a cup is actually 20% of the sodium we need for the day. That's a fifth of imagine how much other food we're going to eat today. And that's already knocking out 20% of it. So that's a really good rule of thumb if you also want to use that in determining whether or not a food is a great choice or not for you. Okay. Now do keep in mind there's trade-offs. Sometimes I eat food that I love and I know it's going to be high in sodium, but I'm also cognizant of what else I'm eating or not eating that day. So that's how you can eat in a way that's flexible, right? And really sustainable, I would say. So you eat for pleasure and you balance that with nutrition. And if you're still confused or need more help navigating that, that's what a dietitian like myself can help you understand a little bit better. Okay, great question. We're on to the next one. What are your thoughts about fillers, additive foods, so they help us feel full? One filler I looked up was a natural laxative. Yeah, great question too. So food fillers are additives that are used to increase volume. Sometimes they're used to dilute strong flavors. Sometimes they're used to help prevent powders from like clumping together. Sometimes they're used to help prevent candies from sticking together. And sometimes they're used to give texture to dough, right? So for most food manufacturers, they're using this filler to like make the final product taste better on our end. They might be using it to save a little money, right? Because if it increases volume, it kind of stretches the product a little bit more. But in the end, fillers, it sounds like they're trying to improve the quality of the product to me when I hear that. So here are some examples of food fillers that you might see on ingredients on a label: maltodextrin, carrageenan, cellulose, soy protein, xanthan gum, guar gum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, fillers are safe when consumed in appropriate amounts, right? So sometimes people may be having high amounts of this, like maybe they're eating the bag or two of candies. I'm not sure. That's where some people sometimes develop like an intolerance to it. And I've worked with some people where they'll say they have some digestive discomfort from fillers and they've identified it specifically, like carrageenan might be something that they've identified specifically. When I eat foods that have it, it doesn't sit right in my gut. So interesting and good to know, right? It just speaks to how unique we all are. Some fillers, for some people, actually aid in digestive relief, and guar gum is a really good example of that. So they sort of help us stay regular, and they're moving things through our tract, and it could be something that is actually a benefit for people. So I think that this is a good question. This is my best answer, that they're safe when it consumes in appropriate amounts. If you've identified that something you ate, again, it might be the amount caused the problem, then that's a good to know, so that you can help identify for yourself what other foods might have that and what are some alternatives. And there are some products use different food fillers, right? And that's what's so interesting about navigating the grocery store too. And a dietitian can help you with that. So if you suspect you have an intolerance to something, especially with the gut, because we're all so unique and there's so many variables and so many things to consider as it relates to digestion, that a dietitian can help you really work and fine tune that for yourself. Okay. Next question: food additives effect on prescriptions. Good question. So there are food additives that may only foods that may interact with drug, but no additives that I'm aware of interact with drugs, right? They're not going to not let a drug do its job or potentially exacerbate the effect of a drug. Just to speak to the most commonly used example of a food and drug interaction is grapefruit and grapefruit juice. So that can interfere with prescriptions and even a few non-prescription drugs, it can cause higher levels of those medications in your body, making the side effects more likely. So just speak to your healthcare provider, I should say yours, sorry, or a pharmacist. The trusted pharmacist can help you navigate that. If you're like, if you are someone who regularly has grapefruit and you're on medications or over-the-counter products and you're just concerned about that, but usually that's right there in the package instructions about how to take anything. So, and it would list and label any food interactions for you. There are no known, again, additives that I'm aware of that could interact with food. Or interact with prescriptions, sorry. I was thinking like it would not be in the best interest of a food company or someone who's making a food additive, like the food scientists out there in the world. They probably wouldn't want to make an additive that can interact with prescription because they're trying to get this food additive into our body, into everyone's body, right? Because then they make some money off of it. So it wouldn't be in their best interest. They would lose customers, right? So great question. That's my best answer. I don't know of any. So there must not be any, right? Because I think we would know by now. You probably would know by now as well. All right, this is our last question. The most unhealthy food additive. Now, I put this question at the end for a reason, because if you watched part one, or after today, if you're going to go rewatch part one on our YouTube channel, there was a lot of discussion about food colors, a lot of discussion about food colors, a lot of discussion about what we do here in the States versus what they do in the European Union in terms of banning food additives. There seems to be a little bit of hysteria about things that seem like there is maybe a concern in a very, very, very specific example when too much of it is consumed, right? So we have governing bodies that make sure that that doesn't happen. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean it hasn't happened, right? And that's why there actually are some laws in place where if there is any potential risk for a food additive causing concern, it's got to go, right? And our governing bodies also review the data, the evidence as time goes on to make sure that any additives that are potentially questionably unsafe are then tested and removed from our food supply if they're not. So sometimes in that hysteria, getting caught up in that worry of, oh, is this safe? What about this food color? This new food additive is being banned. It's banned over in the EU, but not here. Sometimes when we get caught up in that, we forget what truly matters in terms of the evidence about food and some of the additives in our food and our health outcomes. And so I wanted to end on this note, and I wanted just to remind everyone that we don't want to lose sight of this. We want to remind ourselves regularly that we might pay attention to some of the media and some of the, of course, the evolving information about food additives and food and nutrition in our diet, but we want to always remind ourselves the concrete data, the evidence, what it suggests in terms of our health and nutrition and outcomes. So the most unhealthy food additive, I had to say it was a tie. I couldn't think of just one, of course. So I think that there's two that if I were forced to answer this question, what are the most unhealthy food additives? And you probably might have guessed this. So I would say it's a tie. It's a tie between added sugars, maybe sodium, but also sodium nitrite and nitrates. Okay, so they both in really in excessive amounts, especially added sugars, seem to be problematic for our health. Okay, and we're eating way too much of both of these. So we're going to start first with sodium nitrate. So nitrates, you may have heard of them. Those are preservatives that are used in many processed foods like bacon, ham, hot dogs, but also deli meat and some other foods. It helps to retain the red color that's in meat. Otherwise, it would look gray. And we don't really want to eat gray meat, right? That's how Americans eat with our eyes. They also are what give hot dogs and bacon their characteristic flavor. Good to know. That's not a natural flavor. Nitrates are typically found in fatty and salty foods. So if you're someone already automatically looking to improve the nutrition in your diet, if you're starting to minimize fatty and salty foods, that's probably a great step in the right direction, and you're automatically going to start to reduce nitrates as well. We would benefit by eating less of those foods anyway. They don't offer a lot in terms of nutrition. So sodium nitrite and nitrate, why the concern? Research consistently links them with colorectal cancer. And some studies, so a little bit lower quality, but it's there. Some studies also link these nitrites and nitrates to kidney and stomach cancers. So good to know. The nitrites that go under chemical reactions lead to formation of known carcinogens. So we know that they form carcinogens. Now, because of this, companies have since added vitamin C and something called erythrobic, acid to inhibit the formation of those carcinogens, which are called nitrosamines. And that has greatly reduced our concern about them. I think they otherwise would probably be out of our food supply by now. But because of this addition, I think some of the experts are less concerned about it, and our food companies are less concerned. The ones that are trying to do right by us, they're less concerned about it. A lot of people ask me about what about the natural products that say no nitrates added. I would be careful because they instead use something else, right? Anytime someone takes something out of a food and adds something else, it doesn't necessarily automatically make it a better choice. They may use celery juice or celery powder in large quantities instead. Those are naturally high in nitrates. And there have been reportedly 10 times the amount of nitrites found in naturally cured meats compared to the conventional products. Okay, so really good example there. We're not necessarily better than natural or the no nitrate added ones. And they can get away with saying that because it's celery. They're not literally adding nitrates, they're adding celery, which is, interesting. All right, so added sugars next, the other most unhealthy food additive, if I were to pick one. So how many of us eat too many added sugars? I always say I have job security. 3 out of 5 of us are eating too many added sugars. So on average, men consume about 19 teaspoons a day and women consume about 15 teaspoons of added sugar every day. 20% of the added sugar in our diet typically is from sugary drinks, so sugary beverages, you name it. It's literally soda. It could be an energy drink. It could be a sports drink. A lot of people I work with falsely assume hydration products are something they need and that they could be really high in sugar. And then also too, coffee drinks, right? So when we go to our favorite cafe and get a sugary preparation, that might be delicious. It might be just a lot of extra added sugars. What happens when we have too many sugary drinks? And that's what I want to pick on today. Not necessarily added sugars per se, because there is a limit. We're allowed to have added sugars. It's not like we need to eliminate them altogether, right? We just want to minimize our consumption. But sugary drinks seem to be the exception because it seems like these are really problematic for our health. They have been linked with convincing evidence with weight gain and obesity. So sometimes people I'm working with that have a concern over that, we talk about that. Where are their added sugars coming from? And are they having too many sugary beverages? And could we reduce them? Sugary drinks have been also linked with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and of course, go figure, tooth decay. Right, so problematic. Now, the thing with weight gain and obesity is that is indirectly associated with 13 different cancers. So it's not sugar, but it's the sugar that leads to the weight gain that leads to the cancer in some cases. So a little bit more about added sugars. Small amounts are not dangerous. It's not like it's alarming and if we have any at all, right? It's just a concern if we're having too much and then it leads to those health problems. A dietitian can help you understand how to find your sweet spot, get it, for sugar in a healthy diet. Experts do advise that we have less than 10% of our total calories from added sugar. So what that would look like, let's say you're eating 1,600 calories, 10% of that is no more than 160 calories per day from added sugars, or no more than 40 grams per day of added sugar, which is the equivalent of 10 teaspoons. That sounds kind of like a lot, right? That's a decent amount, if you ask me. But if 10% of the calories you're eating are from added sugars, 90% hopefully are coming from really high quality, nutritious foods, right? So 90-10 is pretty nice when you hear it that way. Now, some experts around the world They recommend even less. So I don't know why I put double percentage. I must have been very excited about that. So some experts suggest less than 5%. So again, if we do the math here, then we can figure that out for ourselves. So half of all of those numbers. So 5 teaspoons a day. I think that's a really good goal. That might be ideal for some people, right? So think of it that way. Now we can use the food label here as well to help ourselves and learn what we're eating and how much of the added sugars are coming from some of the foods that we're eating. Now, added sugars are what they sound like. They are added to food. So we might add sugars. Like maybe if we're having a cup of tea and we add a teaspoon of honey, maybe we're having some granola or which might have added sugar if you made it, right? Or maybe we're having oats and we add some maple syrup or some brown sugar to it. You could do the math there and know like how much is in it, how much teaspoon or not, or more you're adding to your food. But on a label, we also have this very conveniently listed here, added sugars. That's what I want you to narrow in on. I don't want you to necessarily narrow in on total sugars because those are naturally present. Just like there is sodium in beets, there are natural sugars in beets, right? And they're supposed to be there. They're meant to be there. They're in a package that are beneficial for us for good health. But when we add a lot of extra sugars in the form of some of these highly processed foods, it's a little bit of a different story. This is a different package, right? Maybe a little less nutritious. So if we look at this particular serving, 8 fluid ounces, so it must be some sort of sweet drink, right? Because there's no protein, there's no fat, so it's basically a sugary drink. It looks like that. So 23 grams of added sugar. So maybe you're someone who is having 1,600 calories a day, and that's your goal. That's already over half of the added sugar that we want you to have. And that's only a measly 8 fluid ounces. That's a tiny little cup. So really helpful tool as well that now, and this wasn't always the case with our food label. We now have this information about added sugars. For added sugars, we don't necessarily want to use the percent daily value because the percent daily value on the nutrition facts panel mostly applies for a 2,000 calorie diet. So again, if we use the example I have on the slide, 10% of a 2,000 calorie diet is going to be a little bit more, right? Because if you're eating more calories, you're going to have a little more added sugar. Again, the exception is for sodium. No matter how many calories we're eating, we want to eat low sodium, right? So that is a really helpful rule of thumb that added sugar on the nutrition facts panel can help you understand what your budget is and how to keep that number lower. Okay. A lot of times I'll compare products, right? So for yogurt is a really good example. I'll compare yogurts and the same type, like a vanilla flavored yogurt, different brands have definitely different added amounts of added sugar. So you can kind of compare and test things out for yourself, or again, work with a dietitian and learn how to find products specifically that fit your needs. Those are all the questions for today. So I wanted to share a couple of resources that I find tremendously helpful. I think you're really going to enjoy this first one. It's from the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and they have something called Chemical Cuisine right on their website, freely accessible. You can search any food additive and it will bring up information about that food additive, a little history of it, what it does, what else it goes by in terms of names. And then now they're very conservative. They're really kind of pushing some of our food companies, they're pushing the government. They're the ones petitioning the government to say, hey, this looks like it causes cancer in animals, even though it was only male rats, not female rats. And even though it was in the forestomach, which humans don't even have either, but it doesn't matter if it caused the cancer in an animal, according to the Delaney clause, which I talked about in episode 1, we need to now not have this in our food supply, right? We're supposed to follow the law. So that is a very, 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 very helpful resource if you want to stay up to date on food additives. If you're worried about sugar, because we did talk about sugar a little bit today, I did I thought it was pretty informative, comprehensive presentation, debunking diet myths in cancer care. And the first question was about sugar and cancer. We did that earlier in April this month. And so you can go ahead and see that on our YouTube channel as well, or you just click on this link. It'll bring you right to that webinar. And then Michigan State University, they're sort of the I think that they're the scientists that is like not necessarily the field that I understand about nutrition, food and nutrition. They are like the food scientist people. And so they have really helpful information. I learned a lot by accessing this website, the food and ingredient safety part of their website. Lots of different blogs, lots of different helpful resources. I found it pretty reassuring that they have some really concrete, definitive data that it helps me feel a little more reassured about some of the questionable additives that we've talked about in this episode of Ask the Dietitian. Now, when I do Ask the Dietitian, I very often like to include some recipes. I think I had beets on the mind. So there's a lot of recipes that include beets. And I just think it's a really great seasonal choice, really vibrantly colored, and a great way to add color to your food if you are looking to remove some of the food colorings. So I thought that might be of interest to you as well. I know I typically avoid beets because there's color everywhere and I stain everything. Now our next Ask the Dietitian is scheduled for May 2nd at 1 o'clock, and we're going to be talking about functional foods. Functional foods, if you haven't heard about them, examples are things like this food will lower your cholesterol, or this food is heart healthy. So they're functional. They're serving a purpose to sort of support our health. And what is it about that food? And it's sort of like an extension on some of the additives as well. But I know most of you will try to ask questions related to this topic, but some of you may stop ask some other questions, and hopefully we can answer all of them next time. So I'm going to stop my share here, and I believe we had some questions in the chat.